Canadian airlines are taking away flights to popular U.S. cities. This after many Canadian vacationers apparently are avoiding the U.S. entirely.
Overnight, Liberals in Canada keep their power after national elections yesterday, giving Mark Carney a full term as Prime Minister. And the new leader did not waste any time going.
Canada's decision to boycott all flights to and from the United States in retaliation to sweeping tariffs announced by newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump has sparked a seismic shift in North American relations. The move represents one of the most dramatic ruptures in the long-standing alliance between the two neighboring countries, whose close economic, cultural, and geopolitical ties have historically underpinned the stability of the Western Hemisphere. As the Canadian government grounded its aviation links with the United States, the world watched a familiar partnership fracture under the weight of a newly aggressive trade doctrine from the Trump administration. The genesis of this diplomatic rupture began with President Trump's unexpected and aggressive tariff policy targeting not only adversarial nations, but also longtime allies. Within days of assuming office, Trump declared sweeping tariffs on imported goods from top trade partners, including Canada, measures justified under the banner protecting American industry and promoting economic nationalism. For Canada, which shares the world's longest undefended border with the U.S. and enjoys deeply integrated supply chains, the announcement was a direct threat to its economic sovereignty. Ottawa responded swiftly and boldly, citing national interest and economic security as Prime Minister Trudeau announced an indefinite suspension of all commercial and passenger air travel to and from the U.S. The boycott, enacted within 48 hours, grounded thousands of flights and caused chaos at airports. It was a high-stakes move meant to signal Canada's strong disapproval of the Trump administration's tariff regime. The implications of this flight boycott are vast, touching economics, diplomacy, security, and public sentiment. Economically, it caused immediate disruption, halting millions in cross-border business, tourism, and cargo. Airlines canceled thousands of routes, grounding planes and furloughing staff, while industries relying on timely cross-border operations, like automotive and aerospace, scramble for alternatives. Diplomatically, Canada's move sent a powerful message, not just to Washington, but globally, that it would not be economically coerced, even by its closest ally. This act of defiance challenged the perception of Canada as a mild-mannered middle power and inspired other nations to consider bold stances in the face of U.S. pressure. The boycott also revealed the fragility of modern global interconnectedness. North America's tightly woven fabric of commerce and mobility was abruptly torn. Families were separated, students stranded, and cultural exchanges canceled. Public reaction was sharply divided. Canadians mostly rallied behind the decision with patriotic fervor, seeing it as a defense of national dignity, while Americans, especially Trump supporters, viewed it as betrayal. Business leaders in the U.S. sounded alarms over long-term economic consequences, particularly in border states dependent on Canadian trade. Security cooperation between the two nations, spanning intelligence, military, and border operations, was strained, prompting concerns among analysts and NATO allies about the stability of one of the West's most reliable bilateral relationships. Logistically, the aviation disruption was unprecedented. Airlines suffered huge losses. Airport staff were overwhelmed, and passengers resorted to land travel or rerouted through third countries. The chaos exposed North America's deep dependency on seamless air travel and the far-reaching consequences when that connection is severed. The Canada-U.S. flight boycott revealed just how dependent modern mobility has become on uninterrupted air travel and how little infrastructure exists to accommodate a sudden collapse of that system. It also tested the resilience of digital workarounds and remote collaboration tools as companies scrambled to shift meetings and operations online. While many businesses adapted through platforms like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, sectors that require physical presence, such as construction, manufacturing, and logistics, faced immediate hardship. Supply chain professionals had to innovate quickly, devising new workflows and sourcing strategies on the fly. Education and healthcare were quietly but deeply affected. Canadian students attending U.S. schools, and vice versa, were stranded, forced to suspend their studies or continue under less-than-ideal remote conditions. Patients who regularly cross the border for specialized medical care were left scrambling, and some transplant operations and urgent surgeries had to be postponed, raising ethical and humanitarian concerns. Globally, the media highlighted the boycott as an unprecedented event, signaling growing volatility in Western alliances. Analysts compared it to past trade wars, but emphasized the added complexity of modern interdependence and real-time global scrutiny. Unlike older disputes handled behind closed doors, the Canada-U.S. flight freeze unfolded publicly and dramatically, turning North America's crisis into a worldwide spectacle, not over ideology or conflict, but over tariffs and deeper issues of power, sovereignty, and identity. Border communities, which often operate more as a single ecosystem than two nations, were hit hardest. Daily life, shopping, studying, working was upended, with flights halted and other transit uncertain. These areas became symbols of a human toll of high-level political disputes. Stories of weddings postponed, businesses shuttered, and people unable to attend funerals just across the border highlighted the emotional cost. Tourism also took a severe hit, as Canada and the U.S., top destinations for one another's travelers, saw bookings collapse. The freeze devastated an already vulnerable industry. Hotels, resorts, and travel services suffered enormous losses, particularly in seasonal hotspots. Experts warned that recovery could take years, depending on the boycott's duration and the depth of the trust erosion between the two countries. Political analysts in both capitals examined the long-term implications. This was no knee-jerk response. It marked a tectonic shift in Canada's approach to its southern neighbor, a disruption of the status quo to assert national interest. For Washington, it served as a wake-up call. Even allies could retaliate against unilateral economic actions. In the weeks that followed, governments, businesses, and civil society groups struggled to adapt. Trade routes were reconsidered, cross-border initiatives paused, and lobbying intensified to find a diplomatic resolution. Yet the damage, economic, social, and diplomatic, was done. The boycott had transformed perceptions. Where there was once routine and trust, now there was suspicion and contingency planning. This dramatic chapter underscored how even deeply entrenched partnerships can be upended by abrupt political decisions. The halt to air travel was not merely a logistical issue, but a bold assertion of national agency amid a climate of growing nationalism and transactional diplomacy. It forced both countries to confront uncomfortable truths about interdependence, leverage, and the cost of confrontation, reshaping the geopolitical dynamics of North America. As the world grappled with the fallout from Canada's sweeping response to President Trump's tariff regime, attention shifted to the broader implications. The severing of air travel between two of the most interwoven nations on Earth didn't just disrupt surface-level commerce. It triggered a cascade of systemic challenges that extended well beyond airport terminals. Few geopolitical fractures had developed so quickly or with such far-reaching scope. Financial markets reacted immediately. Canadian airline stocks plummeted, dragging down sectors like hospitality, aviation services, and cross-border retail. Major carriers on both sides rushed to issue statements to calm investors and passengers, but uncertainty loomed large. Confidence was rattled as American investors, particularly those with exposure to Canadian infrastructure and transportation hubs, began selling off shares, triggering volatility in both the Toronto Stock Exchange and U.S. markets with strong Canadian linkages. What followed was a financial recalibration, as investors reevaluated the perceived safety of North American assets. Canada, long regarded as a stable and reliable partner in global investment, suddenly appeared capable of radical economic action when provoked. While some analysts interpreted this as a sign of strength, others saw it as a risk factor, leading to temporary downgrades in Canadian aviation and tourism-related bonds. Similarly, financial instruments tied to U.S.-Canada commerce, such as trade-linked ETFs and foreign exchange contracts, experienced sudden turbulence. Insurance companies grappled with a surge of claims and policy reviews. Cross-border travel insurance became temporarily void for many policyholders, sparking disputes over coverage. Business interruption claims flooded in, catching underwriters off guard, as few had ever modeled a scenario where the entire air corridor between the two countries might be shut down by government order. For travel insurers, corporate liability assessors, and risk management firms, the event exposed critical gaps in their understanding of geopolitical risk and demanded urgent reevaluation of regional contingencies. As the boycott settled into place, Tech companies emerged not as political players, but as vital facilitators of continuity. The abrupt halt to physical cross-border movement sharply increased demand for virtual infrastructure. Canadian and American firms lean more heavily on cloud platforms, video conferencing systems, and collaborative software at a rate not seen since the pandemic. This shift required massive server load balancing, rapid regional compliance checks, and even the activation of emergency protocols intended for disaster scenarios. Yet the cyber realm was not immune to the geopolitical tension. The erosion of trust between the two governments disrupted long-standing cyber defense collaboration. Channels of intelligence sharing slowed or froze, creating vulnerabilities in joint digital security frameworks. This breakdown offered malicious actors, both state-sponsored and independent, a rare opportunity to probe and exploit weakened cyber defenses. Both nations saw a noticeable rise in phishing attacks, misinformation campaigns, and assaults on critical infrastructure, further straining already pressured systems. On the ground, ordinary citizens felt the boycott's effects in more personal and overlooked ways. Canadian businesses that operated on just-in-time inventory systems faced increasingly empty shelves, not only in manufacturing but also in retail, as U.S.-sourced goods grew scarce. For small business owners, the disruption felt eerily similar to the early pandemic, though this time the culprit was policy, not a virus. Companies dependent on U.S. imports, such as circuit boards, specialized tools, and medical supplies, saw their supply chains throttled or severed. Makeshift networks emerged, both legal and gray market, as entrepreneurs tried to bridge the gap left by grounded flights. Pharmaceutical supply chains were especially hard hit. While Canada manufactures many medications domestically, a significant portion is sourced, compounded, or shipped via the United States. With commercial air cargo suspended, land and sea routes were hastily prioritized for essential medical deliveries. The logistical gymnastics required to ensure medications reached their destinations revealed how deeply air travel served not only commerce but also public health. Pharmacists scrambled to find alternatives or reformulate prescriptions, while hospitals reconsidered procurement strategies, turning to European and Asian suppliers at greater cost and delay. Meanwhile, the cultural ties binding Canadians and Americans began to fray. Major North American music tours, theater productions, and film premieres, typically flowing freely between cities like Toronto, Vancouver, New York, and Los Angeles, were either canceled or split into isolated national legs. The long-standing collaboration between the entertainment industries of both countries, often treated as a unified North American market, was abruptly disrupted. Artists were cut off from large segments of their audiences, while producers dealt with the financial and legal headaches of unfulfilled cross-border contracts. The sports world was equally affected. Leagues with Canadian and American teams saw schedules thrown into chaos. With direct flights suspended, games were relocated, postponed, or canceled outright. Players found themselves stranded, unable to join their home or away teams. Training and competition were compromised, and league organizers struggled to maintain fair play amid logistical nightmares. For fans, a shared passion turned into yet another casualty of international politics. On a policy level, Canada's bold decision reignited national debates around self-reliance, infrastructure, and foreign policy assertiveness. Think tanks and policy institutes convened urgent roundtables to examine how Canada could reduce dependence on American provincial disputes. Infrastructure funding now became a national priority. Proposals to expand domestic airports, establish new air routes with European and Asian partners, and subsidize alternative transportation modes like rail and ferry gained momentum. A growing movement began advocating for the crisis to serve as a catalyst for a long-term restructuring of Canada's international logistics framework. At universities, academic communities mobilized quickly to analyze and inform this rapidly evolving situation. Department of Economics, International Relations, and Public Policy across Canada and the United States began analyzing the implications of the flight boycott with unprecedented urgency. Graduate students rapidly shifted their thesis topics, while professors organized emergency seminars, expert panels, and cross-border webinars to address the unfolding crisis. Canadian and American academics, once accustomed to seamless travel for collaborative research, had to rely on virtual symposiums. However, Many lamented the loss of in-person interactions that fostered spontaneity and deeper connections. Recognizing the disruptive potential of the boycott, research funding agencies began offering special grants to explore its economic, political, and sociological impacts. Religious institutions were not immune to the fallout. Faith communities with congregations spanning the border faced separation during significant religious holidays and life events. Weddings, funerals, and rites of passage that once brought families together across borders were either delayed or restructured. Clergy voiced concerns about the emotional toll of isolation on communities long accustomed to fluid interaction, now strained by decisions made far beyond their reach. As the boycott persisted, protest movements emerged on both sides of the border, though with differing tones. In Canada, a coalition of labor unions, small business owners, and progressive groups rallied behind the government's bold stance, framing it as a reclaiming of sovereignty from an increasingly unilateralist United States. Demonstrators waved flags and chanted slogans in support of domestic manufacturing, fair trade, and national dignity. In contrast, American protests were more fragmented. Libertarian groups condemned what they saw as reckless trade aggression by the Trump administration, while others criticized Canada's response as an overreaction. These divergent narratives widened the cultural gap and deepened mutual suspicion. Legal scholars in both countries swiftly examined the constitutional and regulatory frameworks that allowed such sweeping measures. In Canada, debates flared over the scope of executive authority to suspend such a vital aspect of international mobility. While the move enjoyed strong parliamentary backing, critics argued that more legislative oversight should have been exercised. In the U.S., attention turned to the president's expansive use of the Trade Expansion Act and similar laws to justify tariffs against allies. Lawsuits were filed by affected businesses, with constitutional lawyers questioning the limits of presidential power in trade and foreign policy. In aviation circles, the boycott triggered a frantic behind-the-scenes effort to recalibrate routing software, pilot schedules, and operational logistics. Flight crews were reassigned, retrained, or furloughed, while Canadian-American pilots who regularly flew cross-border routes were forced to shift to domestic flights or relocate entirely. The sudden changes spurred union negotiations and led aviation schools and technical colleges to reassess their curricula in light of shifting industry needs. Meanwhile, tourism ministries in other nations saw opportunity amid the disruption. Countries across Europe, Asia, and South America launched promotional campaigns aimed at attracting Canadian and American travelers now unable to visit each other. Airlines from the UK, Japan, and Brazil ramped up North American advertising in hopes of capturing a market segment stranded by the diplomatic standoff. In an ironic twist, the flight boycott between two neighboring allies resulted in a surge of international tourism to third-party destinations. Though the Canadian government maintained a united public front, internal cabinet debates intensified. Some officials warned that the boycott could invite economic retaliation or alienate moderate Americans who might otherwise be sympathetic to Canadian interests. Others argued that the moment demanded unwavering resolve. The debate went beyond tactics. It was philosophical. Was Canada entering a new era of assertive global posturing, or was this an exceptional act born of necessity? Indigenous communities along the border experienced the boycott in uniquely complex ways. Many of these nations have treaties that predate modern national boundaries and guarantee freedom of movement across the border. The grounding of flights disrupted not only logistical routines, but also cultural practices, traditional ceremonies, and intercommunity gatherings. Indigenous leaders began advocating for the recognition of their sovereign rights, emphasizing that their mobility should not be constrained by geopolitical disputes between settler governments. Indigenous leaders asserted their sovereignty and right to cross-border mobility, emphasizing that treaties with the Crown should not be subordinate to modern geopolitical conflicts. Meanwhile, Canadian embassies around the world were inundated with inquiries from foreign diplomats, all eager to understand the broader implications of the Canada-U.S. standoff. Many feared that if such a profound rupture could occur between two of the world's closest allies, similar fissures might emerge elsewhere. The boycott, therefore, sent ripples through global diplomacy, prompting nations to reevaluate their trade dependencies and the resilience of their strategic partnerships. Within the United States, Canadian consulates became temporary havens for stranded travelers and business people caught mid-trip. Emergency shelters were established in several cities to accommodate those unable to return due to the abrupt cancellation of flights. In a show of soft power and humanitarian values, Canadian diplomatic staff provided not only logistical support, but also projected national values of resilience, compassion, and resolve. As the weeks passed, the economic and social costs of the boycott continued to grow, but so did its symbolic weight. For Canada, it became a rallying cry, a demonstration that even smaller powers could stand firm in the face of economic pressure. For the United States, it was a test of endurance, with the Trump administration unwilling to appear weak or pivot from its hardline trade policies. Between them, a chasm of pride and principle formed, and the world watched to see who would relent first. The consequences of the boycott quickly expanded beyond bilateral tensions, altering geopolitical and economic dynamics globally. With direct air travel suspended between Canada and the U.S., other nations adjusted their positions. Temporary trade corridors, shifting alliances, and realigned diplomatic priorities began to take shape, suggesting that what began as a two-country dispute could leave lasting marks on global diplomacy. European Union member states, observing the breakdown in North American integration, saw both risk and opportunity. On one hand, disruptions in transatlantic supply chains posed challenges, as goods and personnel often passed through U.S. or Canadian air hubs. On the other hand, European logistics firms moved swiftly to fill the void, scaling up operations to reroute transatlantic connections through cities like Frankfurt, Paris, and Amsterdam. Meanwhile, countries such as Mexico and the United Kingdom received increased diplomatic attention from both Ottawa and Washington. Canada, eager to diversify away from U.S. reliance, fast-tracked bilateral agreements with alternative trade partners. Mexican officials embraced this shift, working with Canadian firms to establish new direct cargo and passenger flights and forming cross-border trucking partnerships to reroute goods through Mexican hubs. For the United Kingdom, newly untethered from the European Union, this moment offered a chance to reassert global relevance. London hosted emergency trade talks with Canadian officials, while British consulates in Canada held press events to highlight the enduring strength of the Commonwealth relationship. Both nations expressed interest in expanding their trade continuity agreement into a more permanent and comprehensive accord. British businesses moved to fill gaps left by the U.S. in sectors like processed foods and aerospace components. China also monitored the situation closely. Viewing the boycott as a strategic opening, Chinese state-owned enterprises quietly initiated negotiations with Canadian corporations in sectors like mining, telecommunications, and manufacturing. The aim was to strengthen China's foothold in markets traditionally dominated by American interests. Chinese airlines applied for new routes into Canadian cities, offering alternatives for cargo and passenger traffic once routed through the U.S. These moves sparked concern in Washington, where officials began voicing alarm over China's growing economic influence in Canadian corridors. Beyond state actors, multinational corporations began reevaluating their North American strategies. Tech giants with operations that span the border reconsidered the placement of data centers, customer service hubs, and logistics nodes. Border cities like Buffalo, Detroit, and Vancouver became less viable for centralized operations, prompting companies to build parallel infrastructures on both sides of the border to maintain service continuity amid future disruptions. This trend was especially pronounced in cloud computing, fintech, and AI development, sectors where operational downtime was not an option. As uncertainty grew, the global consulting industry experienced a surge in demand. Firms specializing in international logistics, political risk analysis, and supply chain restructuring became critical lifelines for businesses. Clients ranged from small e-commerce retailers to multinational manufacturers, all seeking guidance on how to navigate the fractured North American landscape. Some consulting firms even established rapid response teams focused exclusively on U.S.-Canada disentanglement, underscoring just how significant and far-reaching the fallout had become.